I want to get started just by, for some of you, this term evidence-based policing might be new. I think many of you probably have heard it before, but I wanted to get started briefly on just a short definition because it really starts us off on this journey about how to look at research and why it's so important. So evidence-based policing really is articulated well in this Ideas in American Policing piece, which you have in your workbooks by Larry Sherman. This was written in 1998. There are a number of people who talked about research in policing, but this is one I think that really brings the point home about why research is important. And in that piece he says, police practices should be based on scientific evidence about what works best. What he was talking about here was a couple of things. One, that policies and practices are based on rigorous research evidence, okay? Rigorous research evidence. And two, that decision making should reflect some kind of scientific process. So many of you have heard problem-oriented policing, yes? Problem-oriented policing is really a reflection of a type of scientific method, and it's in a sense tells you, look, we need to be more analytic, we need to be more scientific about the way we make decisions. So evidence-based policing is very much similar to the notion of evidence-based medicine. If somebody gives you a medication to take, you want to know that there's some kind of research behind that, yeah? Like you don't want to be taking a medication that hasn't been tested for effectiveness, that could harm you, that could not work at all, and you might think it works. The same is true in social science, the same is true in social interventions like policing. However, this notion doesn't translate similarly in policing as it does in medicine. I would never take a medication unless I knew, at least that it was approved for, through some kind of testing, right? In policing, this is not the case. And by the way, this is not just policing, education, corrections, you name it. Okay, so this notion of evidence-based policing is actually quite innovative, and it's a recent phenomenon, quite honestly. This idea that research should inform practice seems logical to a scientist, but I think if I had to go back, I used to be a police officer, and if I had to go back and put my police hat on, I don't think I would say this seems logical to me. I think a lot of police decisions are based on procedures, experience, a consensus about best practices, whoever that consensus might be from. And so it kind of turns decision making of policing on its head, I think. The notion of evidence-based policing, there's a lot of questions and issues with it, especially given this culture that I talk about in American policing, that really it's not always receptive to this notion of science, right? But I'm not going to get into that at the moment because we're going to talk a little bit about that later. But what I would really like to focus on, and Howard, if you can give me a sense of if I go over the time a little bit, because I can't see a clock in here. Yeah, I will. Okay. Howard, you know me, right? Like I could go on forever, so I will try to keep it short. But evidence-based policing really comes up with there's a lot of questions, but in my view, the questions that I want to focus on today is what is the research evidence, right? What evidence should we believe? How do we access this research easily? How do you make some generalization from some study that was done someplace else to your jurisdiction? Can you make a generalization to your jurisdiction? That's what science is about, right? Like, how do we pull some generalization in order to apply it to where I am here in my jurisdiction, okay? So I think these are some basic questions I would want to know if somebody told me, hey, use research to help your decision making in your police agency, okay? And these are some of the basic questions that I feel need to be addressed. I want to show this because just to say that there are a whole bunch of research studies on police practices. When I say a whole bunch, I mean in the thousands, okay, thousands. And this is just some of the interventions that have been studied in policing. Most of these studies are from the United States and the United Kingdom. These things have been evaluated for effectiveness, and these studies range from extremely well done to really, really bad studies, okay? Like, we implemented this program here, crime went down, so therefore it works, okay? Really bad study, but that is reflected in the research evidence, right? So there's quite a bit of information of varying quality and topical areas. Even when, so the matrix is about filtering. We basically did the work for you. We filtered all the studies that aren't very rigorous. Even when we filter for that, we have 103 studies now that police agencies can use to inform their decision making. And these studies are on all sorts of things and across all types of different methods used. So the big question, if I were a commander, was how do I make sense of this and then apply it to my particular agency or issue at hand? And that's where the matrix was born, really. Chris, Cody, and I, we saw that we work a lot with this body of research, and we said, how do we make this accessible? And so we decided to come up with this matrix. And I put the website down here. There's a shorter website that one of my assistants put together. It's, I think, policingmatrix.org. It's like an easier website to remember. But you can just put in evidence-based policing matrix in Google, and this will come up. There's nothing fancy about this. It's simply a visual binning tool, and then we put it online for you, for anybody to access. So it's freely available for anybody to access. And it currently houses, it is now the only place that houses all moderately rigorous to rigorous policing research that's available on interventions. Okay? So there's 103 studies within it.
So Cynthia,
yes, Claudia. Yes. So every year we update it. So the matrix, and part of this is part of our graduate program, like the training of our graduate assistants in the center. They help me populate it. We look at studies, we judge them for whether or not they're rigorous or not. We make based on a coding system. By the way, for those of you who want to see that coding system, it's inside your book. There's a whole article on that. But yes, Claudia, the answer is every year it'll be populated, and with new studies that come out during that year. Okay. And by the way, somebody asked me about matrices for other, because we only focus on interventions. There's just so much work out there. We just focus on interventions, but someone asked me if they could do one for police fear of crime, a matrix for fear of crime. I said, great. I mean, if they could do something like that and add that, that would be fantastic. This only shows outcomes of crime reduction, crime and disorder reduction. Okay, so how does the matrix work? The list of studies that I just showed, there are actually a lot of similarities between those studies and crime prevention programs more generally. If you start looking at crime prevention programs, they tend to group across similarities. And Chris, Cody, and I, we came out with 3 dimensions that we keep seeing over and over and over again in every policing study that we've looked at. One is the scope of the target. Usually police focus on individuals, groups of individuals, small places, neighborhoods, jurisdictions, larger places. Sometimes in some countries they go up to nation or state. We actually don't have anything populated in that area. But there is this scope of target that comes up over and over and over again. Interventions can also be categorized by their level of proactivity. I'm sorry, I'm struggling. It's my level of proactivity. Some interventions are reactive, some are more proactive, some are very highly proactive in policing. Okay? And finally, there's a trend in interventions for generality. Many police interventions are very general, putting police out saturated patrol in an area of high visibility. That's a very general approach. all the way to a very specific or focused approach. Nuisance abatement for a drug house, to try to evict people from it who are selling drugs. It's like very specific, an intervention. And some of these interventions are very specific in that they involve multiple partners. So they don't involve just the police, they might involve other people. Okay, so once we started looking at all these tactics that have been evaluated, we could start binning them into the matrix. And let me just give you a kind of a quick example here. This particular tactic, it's just kind of a hypothetical tactic, but this particular tactic that a study was done on was a tactic that occurred at the neighborhood level, maybe a community-oriented policing tactic. It was reactive to a particular problem in that neighborhood, and then the police came in and tried to do something in that neighborhood to deal with that problem. And it was very general, saturation patrol, or visibility of police, or generally talking to people in the neighborhood. Okay, so this study can be binned in that way. So the idea is to bin every single study that's out there that is at least moderately rigorous. Okay, and what we came up with after we did this, we looked at every single study, coded them, and we came up with the matrix. And what you're seeing here is, let me just make sure I give you this, what I wanted to say here. What you start seeing here is clustering of information around certain intersecting dimensions. Okay? So, for example, neighborhood-based tactics that are proactive, that are general in nature, are reflected by this cluster of information. By the way, you can access this cluster of information. This cluster of information on whether or not those tactics or strategies are effective. The black dots indicate that the study showed that the intervention was significantly positive. The gray dots show a mixed result. So it might work, it may not. The clear dots show a non-significant result. This is not a scientific statement, so I have to make a disclaimer, but I'm going to say it didn't work. Like the intervention didn't work. You can't really ever prove anything in science, so I'm not supposed to say that, but I'm going to just use it here because it's really not important, the nuance. And then the upside down red arrow is interventions that backfired, that actually caused increase in crime, increase in recidivism, that harmed people, that caused more victimization. Yes, there are police strategies that do that. Okay, so and many other criminal justice strategies that do this. So the matrix is kind of an organization of these different studies. Let me give everyone a word of caution about the matrix. Not all studies are created equal. The more rigorous an evaluation is, and this goes for evaluations that you're doing in your agencies, the more rigorous an evaluation is, the more believable it is. The less rigorous evaluation is, the less believable it is. Here's the problem with policing studies that we know is true. How do we know this is true? Because we've actually studied this. The studies that have been done that are less rigorous are more likely to show positive results. Okay? Let me repeat this. The studies that are less rigorous are more likely to show positive results. So when you're looking at an evaluation that says, zero tolerance arrests in microplaces, it's very effective. If that study wasn't done well, then the chances that it's tricking you into believing that it worked is higher. Okay? So, and there's this trend in police studies especially that shows this, an overly optimistic field of research. Okay? And let me just show you, just to make an example of this, what I mean. Here's the most rigorous studies in the matrix, and here are all the studies. Okay? So most rigorous and all the studies. notice how the neighborhood slab almost completely disappears. This is where all your community-oriented policing studies are. Many of your community-oriented policing studies are. Many of your patrol beat level studies, right, are in this neighborhood area. So I just say this as a word of caution. You might ask, well then, Cynthia, why did you put these in there? Why? Because evidence-based policing, in my view, is about flexibility. We cannot simply, as scientists, ask the police only to look at very, very rigorous studies, because then you would not have much to look at, okay, as this shows here. And I think that this compromise, as long as we show you which studies are moderate and allow you to make the decision whether or not you want to use them, is responsible on our part. So the matrix allows you to filter out these studies. You don't have to look at them, or you can look at them to get a sense of what might be promising. Okay? Because if you do have a lot of studies on a particular policing tactic that show promise, but that are moderately rigorous, then I think that gives us some hint about whether or not that approach might be useful. Okay? So there's some flexibility, I think, that needs to be built into evidence-based policing. Some scientists may not agree with me on this. Okay? So this is a point of discussion. Okay, how to use the matrix. Back to the clustering of information. What the matrix essentially does is allow the police to do a couple of things. One, you can now see generally what types of intersecting dimensions are generally useful. Okay? So instead of looking at, you can, by the way, instead of looking at this one study and saying, what can I learn from this one study and how can I apply it to my police department, I can now look at a clustering of studies that reflect neighborhood-based, proactive, and general approaches. And if I think that area, that grouping of research is useful, I can then apply it to planning my own intervention, okay, according to whatever your needs are with your agencies. And secondly, so it gives this information. And by the way, there are some clusters that are not very promising. The area of individual approaches in policing, by the way, police primarily use individual-based tactics, which are focused on individuals. The information in that area does not show often a lot of promise. Okay? Why? Because a lot of times these things are reactive. They're like reacting to somebody who already has committed a crime and you're trying to locate them. And so oftentimes we find there are some effective strategies, but there's it's a mixed bag in that area. Okay? So you can see kind of this, where these general types of prevention mechanisms, what are most promising, and it allows you something to compare your tactics against. Oftentimes you don't have time to conduct a randomized controlled experiment in your agency. You just want to know, is this intervention likely going to work if I'm going to do it? What does the research say about similar types of interventions? And that's what we're trying to provide here with this kind of visual systematic review, essentially, is what it is. Okay? Let me just give you kind of a summary of this, but in words more. So, what does the matrix tell us? Well, 79% of successful intervention studies occur at micro places or neighborhoods. Place-based approaches to policing have looked very promising, okay, as opposed to individual-based approaches. So approaches that attack places as opposed to people. 64% of successful interventions are more focused or tailored. This is confirmed by the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council's work of David Weisbrod and John Eck, who also found that more tailored approaches are more effective in reducing crime, as opposed to general strategies like saturation patrol, for example. 80% of successful interventions are either highly proactive or highly proactive. What I mean by proactivity is that they use some kind of information to anticipate where, when, who is going to commit the next crime. I'm not talking about the fancy stuff of trying to figure out exactly who's going to get victimized and exactly what time. Okay, it's hard to have that type of prediction. I'm just talking about general crime analysis to work on looking at proactivity, trying to look at trends and anticipate where crime is going to occur. About half of interventions that show no effect or a backfire effect focus on targeting individuals. Okay? So just as a side note, by the way, and I just want to go through this very quickly, if we were to ask, are American police evidence-based, right? And I just put a couple of slides in here regarding this. In some cases, yes, there has been a movement. There's been a lot of rhetoric, and there's been a diffusion of this innovation about using research and science in practice. And you start seeing ad hoc use of this in specialized units, so problem-oriented policing units, et cetera. You see it now required by government solicitations. In the recent BJA project, it's Smart Policing Project, it's required. And you see this increased importance of crime analysis and researchers in policing, much more so than 10 years ago, okay? Or 20 years ago. Are police today evidence-based? Well, there's a number of aspects of American policing that do not reflect an evidence-based approach, and there are many reasons for this. I give a whole lecture just on kind of cultural and organizational aspects of police that go into why this is, and there's also some politics involved. You're going to hear that in other lectures today as well. But there's a number of reasons why police still are not evidence-based. Okay, I want to just start quickly on then how can the police use the research evidence, and that's when I'm going to move into Howard's presentation. So Howard, give me just about 3 more minutes, okay? How can the police use this research evidence? I just want to show everybody this online tool just really quickly. And just kind of walk you through just a few of the... Yes?
On the 53% of the backfire effect of targeting individuals...
Or doesn't work. Doesn't work or backfire.
Right. Is that because, are you implying that that's their only strategy? Or is that part of a multifaceted approach? Like if I have an individual who, if I'm getting hit by a wave of burglaries and I just check with Maryland Parole and Probation and find out that a career burglar just got released back out into the neighborhood.
Yes.
That's going to be one aspect of the strategy.
That's
so
right.
Is that percentage just inferring that that's just one single approach and they took no other approach?
Yes. So much of the interventions are looking at single approaches. Although there are some interventions that look at a combination of approaches so that they're very tailored approaches. Some of the problem-oriented policing approaches, for example, might use focusing on that individual, doing another particular intervention and attaching that to that particular strategy, etc. So I say that, but I also say with an emphasis that much of policing is still focused on these single tactics that are focused on individuals. Okay? But yes, very, very good point. Okay, so evidence-based policing matrix, just to show you very briefly, it's an online tool. You can actually go into a particular study and read a very quick summary of what that study is about. Or you can look at an entire slab, and this is something we included in your workbook. So we printed out all the slabs in your workbook, and in the slabs, it shows you the methodological rigor. So M is moderately rigorous, V is very rigorous, right? It shows the methodological rigor of the study. It shows just a very quick, what was the intervention, what was the result. The black dot is, it worked. The red triangle, it backfired, right? And you can actually go into the studies, read them, etc. For those of you who don't like this type of approach and want to see all the data at once, you can simply download the matrix. We believe in complete transparency. So you can download all of our codings, you can download how we did it, and we often get scholars who write to us and say, why did you score my study in that way? And we have a conversation with them, because that's like part of thinking about, on our side, how we code studies, okay? So just to kind of give you a sense of the matrix. How might this matrix be used? Well, Howard's going to go into this a little bit about how he used this in Derbyshire, in his police force in Derbyshire in the United Kingdom. But just briefly, I mentioned to you that the interventions can be mapped into the matrix. So I give an example here of dealing with auto thefts. I see the commissioner from Baltimore City is here, but when I started commissioner, I used to use these hot lists, like paper, where it would have lists of tags. And somebody would give me these lists of tags, and I would have to find the cars that were stolen on this paper list, okay? Known as hot lists. This type of approach is not necessarily very efficient or effective. It's an individual-based approach. It's very reactive. It's extremely general. Who knows how long the tags have been on there, right? Now, this is an approach that was used many years ago. Okay? Now there are many more advanced ways of dealing with auto theft and looking at hot lists, particularly license plate recognition technology, right? There's also an approach like education. So giving people tickets for not locking their car doors, telling folks, hey, don't leave your GPS systems in your car, okay? It's a neighborhood-based approach. It's more proactive. It's a little bit more specific. Notice how police can now map studies against the research to kind of see where does this fall in the research area. And another approach might be, okay, use some higher level technology, LPR. By the way, there are now 2 experimental evaluations on LPR that do not necessarily show that they work in crime hotspots. We can talk about, we have a whole LPR web portal if you want to take a look at that research. But I say that with a caveat because I think it can be effective, but it's the way that LPRs are used and the underlying information that they have for the LPRs that still need development. But you could have something where you use that type of technology in a hotspot combined with education. It could be more specific, and it might fall into the realm of a matrix that might be useful.